Thanks so much, Jason. It is absolutely an honor for me to be here at this little event that you put on. I say little, it's amazing. If you were around Ruby 10 years ago, when there were conferences like this all over the country, this would feel very familiar to you. And so I am happy to be back in a place like this. So if you've ever been to Paris, you probably remember the moment that you first spotted the Eiffel Tower. Maybe it was out the plane window as your plane was coming into the city. Maybe it was peeking up over the buildings in the Jardin des Tuileries near the Louvre. But it probably gave you chills that said, I'm really here, I'm really in Paris. Even if you've never been to Paris, you probably still recognize the Eiffel Tower anytime you see it in print or in film. It's the emblem of Paris and of France, and it's almost universally recognized. Well, earlier this summer, I had the amazingly good fortune to find myself standing in front of the Eiffel Tower with my family. Now, I'm not normally one to foist vacation photos on a room full of strangers, but this picture my wife took of our son is one of my favorite pictures in the whole world. We had just finished a picnic on the Champ de Mars. My son pulled out his trip notebook and he started to sketch the Eiffel Tower. He sketched it 4 times because he was so insistent on getting it right. You can see how captivated he is by the tower, how hard he's working to capture it accurately. And if you've ever seen the Eiffel Tower, you know the Eiffel Tower just does this to you. It pulls you in. It makes you pay attention. Now, I knew a little bit of the history of the Eiffel Tower already, but as I sat there watching my son draw, I found myself thinking about the circumstances that brought the tower into existence. When it was completed in 1889, the Eiffel Tower, at 1,000 feet tall, became the tallest structure in the world by almost doubling the height of the recently completed Washington Monument. Now, how did Gustave Eiffel build something so tall using late 1800s technology? Why build such an ostentatious statement piece in the first place? Well, to understand that, we have to know a little bit about French history. Just a little, I promise. Now, this is Napoleon III. This is not the Napoleon that you've heard of. This is actually the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was elected as the president of France in 1848. And at the end of his 4-year term in 1852, he decided that he wasn't ready to go. And so he threw a coup for himself and declared himself the Emperor of France, much like his uncle before him. Now, the French people weren't exactly thrilled about being under an emperor again when most of them wanted to be in a republic. But Napoleon had led France over the past 4 years into a period of prosperity that most of them were satisfied enough that they just couldn't be bothered to revolt. And so Napoleon kept leading the country until 1870. The prosperity of France ended with the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Napoleon picked a fight with Prussia on the northern border of France, part of modern-day Germany. And he did this because he was uncomfortable with the amount of influence that Prussia was building in the region. But he bit off a little bit more than he could chew. In his army, he was captured in a massive defeat at the Battle of Sedan on September 4th, 1870. You can see our friend Napoleon here right in the middle of the picture, handing over his sword after losing the battle. It was an embarrassment for Napoleon and an embarrassment for France. Well, with Napoleon gone, the French set up a new Republican government. And the first job of this new Republican government was to get the Prussians to go home, because they were intent on staying there and occupying the northern part of France. To get them to leave, the French had to pay huge reparations in order to retain their territory, and that plunged France deep into debt. Their prosperity was gone, and their defeat in the Franco-Prussian War was a huge blow to the collective French ego. By the early 1880s, about 10 years later, France was nearly back on its feet. It had largely recovered from the defeat and the subsequent reparations from the Franco-Prussian War. The Republican government that had been enacted at the end of Napoleon III's empire had held its own against plenty of challenges and hard times, and it was slowly guiding France back into prosperity. And the 30-year renovation of Paris by Georges-Eugène Haussmann, replacing some of Paris's narrow medieval streets with broad avenues like this one that bears his name, was nearing completion. Paris was ready to show off. And what better way to do that than to put on another World's Fair? Prince Albert, the husband of Britain's Queen Victoria, had the idea in 1851 to invite all the nations of the world to come to London and show off their industrial progress. Well, the French liked this idea so much that they did the same thing 4 years later, in 1855. And then again in 1867. And another time in 1878, 8 years after Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Sedan. Now, the 1878 exposition was supposed to be France's recovery party. It was supposed to mark the recovery from the Franco-Prussian War. But France was still so embroiled in politics at this point that they didn't actually start preparing for the exhibition until 6 months before it was supposed to start. It was a bit of a shambles. And so in the early 1880s, a movement to host yet another World's Fair was picking up steam in Paris. An organizing committee was formed to start making preparations, and the first thing they did was to pick a date. And what better date than the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille? Now, the storming of the Bastille was the symbolic start of the French Revolution that overthrew the monarchy. It's much like the signing of the Declaration of Independence in the United States, and Bastille Day is still celebrated every year in France, just like Independence Day is here. And so they picked a date that would encompass the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. Now, each of the exhibitions, except for the 1878 one, had been bigger and grander than the one before it. So one of the first things that the committee did was to launch a competition to design a giant centerpiece monument for the exhibition. You can see where this is going. That competition got the attention of these two gentlemen, Maurice Coquelin and Émile Nouguier, two structural engineers at La Compagnie des Établissements Eiffel. The two of them had just finished working together on the beautiful Garabit Viaduct. At 407 feet below the Truyère River below it, it was the highest bridge in the world when it opened in 1884. Now, they had the idea of using the same engineering principles to build a giant tower as the centerpiece of the exhibition. So they got to work. And this sketch by Maurice Coquelin is what they came up with. You can see on the right-hand margin of the page here sketches of several other monuments to show the scale of this tower they intended to build. You can see down at the bottom there's Notre Dame, and then right above it the Statue of Liberty. A little bit further up you can see l'Arc de Triomphe. They were proposing to build a tower 300 meters tall, 1,000 feet, the tallest structure in the world. Coquelin and Nouguier were excited, and they took the sketch to their boss to pitch. And as you might have guessed from the name of the company, their boss was none other than Gustave Eiffel. Now, Eiffel was a little bit lukewarm on this whole competition idea. His firm had just finished the Garabit Viaduct, and he wasn't looking for another big project to take on. He was looking to take a little bit of time off. He also was a little bit frustrated that his beautiful city kept spending massive amounts of money on these huge exhibitions, only to tear all the buildings down a year later. Eiffel liked to build things of significance, things that were going to last. The design competition requirement that the Centrepiece Monument be easy to dismantle was a complete non-starter for Eiffel. Coquelin and Nouguier had hoped to change his mind and get him excited about the competition with the grandioseness of their idea, but it just wasn't enough. And so they enlisted the help of this man, Stephen Sauvestre. Sauvestre was Eiffel's chief architect, and he suggested several modifications to the design to make it more useful and aesthetically pleasing. And if you look carefully at Coquelin's drawing, you can see the modifications Sauvestre suggested sketched in here in pencil. There was a large observation deck glassed in on the first level of the tower. Further up at the top, he had added a cupola with another observation deck, and capped, of course, by the French flag. In the final design, you can see all three observation decks as the tower exists today. And you can see the lace-like decorative arches suggested by Sauvestre. Now this got Eiffel excited. A tower where people could view all of Paris from heights previously reserved for balloonists? That was amazing. It would be possible to do weather observations and even make radio transmissions from such a high point. And so he bought the patent for the design rights from Coquelin, Nouguier, and Sauvestre and began the hard work of getting his design selected. The idea was immediately popular with the French public, who loved the idea of dwarfing the just completed Washington Monument and besting the upstart Americans. It was not, however, immediately popular with the architects, artists, and most importantly, the politicians around Paris. And so Eiffel went on the offensive. This was his first writing on the subject. The tour en fer de 300 mètres de hauteur destinée à l'exposition de 1859, which roughly translates the 300-meter-high iron tower for the 1889 exhibition. If any of you speak French, I apologize. This particular copy, which sold at auction in 2015 for just shy of $10,000, was addressed to General Georges Boulanger, a prominent politician who would go on to be the French war minister. But Eiffel was giving copies and meeting with anybody who would give him an audience. He also went before the Société d'Ingénieurs Civils, the Society of Civil Engineers, to present his idea and stand for questioning, and oh boy did they have questions. One of Eiffel's chief critics was Paul Planat. the founder and editor of the architectural journal La Construction Moderne. Now, Planat was not at all impressed with Eiffel's design, and he felt it was counter to the hard work that Haussmann had done to beautify Paris in the Great Renovation. Specifically, in the May 1st, 1886 issue of his magazine, he said, "Eiffel's design is nothing more than an inartistic scaffolding of crossbars and angled iron. It looks hideously unfinished." Pierre Tirard, a powerful politician who would go on to become the Prime Minister of France, decried the monument as anti-artistic, contrary to French genius. It's a project more in character with America, where taste is not yet very developed, than Europe, much less France. And Charles Garnier, a prominent French architect, led the most famous protest against Eiffel's tower, forming the Committee of 300, one member for each meter in height of the proposed tower, made up of some of the most prominent figures in the arts and architecture in Paris. Their protest, published in prominent Parisian paper Le Temps, said in part, "Imagine for a moment a giddy, ridiculous tower dominating Paris like a gigantic black smokestack, crushing under its barbaric bulk Notre Dame, the Tour Saint-Jacques, the Louvre, the Dome of les Invalides, the Arc de Triomphe. All of our humiliated monuments will disappear in this ghastly dream." He had a flair for the dramatic, in case you couldn't tell. But it was around this time that Edouard Lecroy was named the Minister of Trade and put in charge of the exhibition. And this meant that he was in charge of wrapping up the design competition. He had been among those that Eiffel had met with and lobbied with his design. And despite the protest of the artists, he and the rest of the political class quite liked Eiffel's design. In calling for final proposals, Lecroy amended the guidelines of the competition to call for a tower of at least 300 meters in height. And he gently suggested that it might be built of iron, an obvious nod to Eiffel's design. Now, some of the other entrants were pretty funny. They included a 300-meter tall lighthouse built of granite, which would have been impossible to ever build because it would have been too heavy. There was a 300-meter tall water sprinkler in case Paris ever experienced drought to water the many gardens that had just been installed in the renovation of Paris. There was even a 300-meter tall guillotine, a nod to the French Revolution. Now, not all the designs were that silly. Some of them were quite serious, but in the end, Eiffel's design was the only one that was practical or even possible to build. And so, on June 12, 1886, Lecroy gave an overjoyed Eiffel the news that his design had been selected. That joy was short-lived, however, because the French government balked at Eiffel's estimate of 6 million francs, a little over $1 million US at the time, for building the tower. The government had originally committed to fund the entire tower, but quickly backtracked to an offer of 1.5 million francs, about a quarter of the cost of the tower. That meant that Eiffel would need to secure investors for the remaining 4.5 million francs, and to do that, he needed to be able to make money from the tower. So he requested two provisions from the French government. First, he requested that he be allowed to charge admission to the tower. And second, he requested that the tower remain intact not for 1 year as originally proposed, but for 20 years. So he'd have more time to make his money back. The government agreed in principle to this, but it created another problem. The exhibition was to be held on the Champ de Mars in the 7th arrondissement just south of the Seine River. Now, the Champ de Mars was the French army's primary drilling ground at the time. And Eiffel had proposed to build his 1,000-foot tall tower right in the middle of the Champ de Mars. Now, the army was already resigned to losing their drilling ground for the year it would take to assemble and host the exposition. It couldn't be avoided. It happened every time that the Parisian government decided to throw an exhibition. But having a giant tower in the middle of their drilling ground for 19 years after the exhibition ended, well, that just wouldn't do. And so after much negotiating, it was agreed that the tower would instead be located in the northwest portion of the Champ de Mars, near the bank of the Seine, leaving most of the field open for the military drilling once the exposition was dismantled. Now, Eiffel knew that this would complicate the foundation, but he didn't have much choice but to compromise if he wanted to see his tower built. French bureaucracy being what it was, it took another 6 anxious months for the contract to be finalized and the funding to be put in place. Eiffel was starting to worry that he wouldn't have time to build his tower. But finally, on January 8, 1887, Eiffel had a signed contract in hand. He immediately began gathering supplies and hiring workers, and on January 28, 1887, Eiffel's workers finally began work on the foundation of the tower. They had a little over 2 years until the planned opening of the exposition. Now, I mentioned that moving the tower closer to the Seine complicated the foundation work, and here's what I mean. The east and south legs of the tower rested on solid ground on the side of the site that was close to the Champ de Mars. Each leg of the tower rested on 4 6.5-foot thick slabs of concrete, one for each of the principal girders. And for the east and south legs, this was simply a matter of excavating and pouring concrete. It was no big deal. But the west and north legs of the tower were far more complicated because they were on the side of the site closest to the Seine. Now, the ground here was made of millions of years of sediment deposit from the river, which, as you can imagine, is much less stable. Each of the 4 slabs for each leg required 2 piles to be driven 72 feet in the ground to reach the bedrock below the sediment. Those are deep piles. But that wasn't even the complicated part. They still had to pour the 6.5-foot foundations, and the problem with that part of the site is if you dug down 6.5 feet, you would be below the water table of the river. And so in order to pour these foundations, Eiffel's team used these giant 50 by 20-foot cast iron caissons. And they filled them with compressed air to keep the water from infiltrating their work site, keep the holes from flooding so that they could pour the foundation. The caissons started on the surface and sunk further and further down as his workers dug out the foundations and poured the concrete. 5 months later, on June 30th, 1887, the foundations were finished. And this is what the foundation for each of the 4 legs looked like when it was completed. This is just the foundation for one of the 4 legs. Each foundation pier had 2 bolts embedded into it to bolt the shoe of each primary girder. Now, the bolts in this picture look pretty tiny, right? They're actually 4 inches in diameter and 25 feet long. They go deep into the foundation to provide the tower the stability that it would need. Well, Eiffel's team did not waste a second in beginning the ironwork. As soon as the foundations were ready, they started bolting things to it. And you can see here how the primary girders attach to the foundation piers. And the reason for this is twofold. First, it allows some of the weight of the tower to be borne vertically and some of it to be borne horizontally. When you're dealing with ground that's not as stable as you would like it to be, you want to spread the load out as much as possible. So forcing the load to come down the curve into an angled foundation helped them spread out that load. The other thing was, this is the tallest thing that anybody had ever built. And one of the things that Eiffel spent the most time on in creating this design was the wind load at the top of the tower. The wind load would be pretty significant for a 1,000-foot tall iron tower, so kicking the legs out like this would provide it much greater lateral stability in the face of heavy winds. Work progressed on the tower quickly, in large part due to the precision of the drawings produced by Eiffel's office. In all, there were 1,700 general drawings made, and a further 3,629 drawings of specific parts that needed to be manufactured to build the tower. And these were not lackadaisical drawings. The position of the rivet holes in these drawings was down to 1/10 of a millimeter. The angles, down to 1/2 of arc, which is 1/3600th of a degree. The precisely drawn parts were then forged and drilled in Eiffel's factory in La Valparais on the outskirts of Paris, and they were brought to the site on a horse-drawn carriage. It would be a few decades from this point before Henry Ford would invent his Model T. Early in 1888, they had reached a critical juncture in the first phase of construction. Because the rest of the tower would rise from the first platform, it was absolutely critical that the 4 legs of the tower be level. The tower was so tall that a few millimeters out of true at the first level could result in a foot of difference or more at the top of the tower. And Eiffel's plan for dealing with this was ingenious. Each leg was built at a very slightly steeper angle than intended. And I mean slight. When I say slight, we're talking a couple of centimeters. And then you can't see it in this picture, but the legs aren't actually resting on the scaffolding. At the critical point of support where the scaffolding meets each leg, the leg rests on a large sandbox. And the reason Eiffel did this is so that he could adjust the height of these legs to millimeter level precision. The way it worked is because they were built slightly steeper than they needed to be, there was a cork at the bottom of the sandbox, and they slowly drained sand out of the sandbox and let that leg settle until they got it exactly where they wanted it to be. Once they had all 4 legs to the exact correct height, all they had to do was join them together to lock them in place. And so on March 20th, 1888, the first and most complicated portion of the tower was completed. They didn't celebrate, though, because they still had 800 feet to go, and they only had a year to do it. As they built up from the first level, it became increasingly complicated to get the parts they needed up to the area where they were working. To solve this, they used the first level as a staging area. A large steam crane again, internal combustion engines wouldn't become commonplace for several more decades. A large steam crane would lift parts from ground level up to the first level. They'd assembled a miniature railroad on the first level, so when the crane picked up the tower, they would put it on a railroad car, and the railroad car would cart it around to whatever leg of the tower was intended to go up. And then another crane that was up closer to the work area would reach down and pluck the part from the first level. You can actually see those cranes at the top of this picture. And these cranes are mounted to the elevator tracks that are built into the pillars, and they moved up the tower as it was built. By July, the tower was complete up to the second level. And if you look in the background here, you can start to see other buildings for the exposition are starting to take form. The exposition was slated to start in 8 months, and they still had 600 feet to go. Another issue Eiffel's team had to solve was how to rivet pieces together so far off the ground. The tower was almost entirely assembled by riveting. The way this worked is the prefabricated parts were brought to the tower, hauled up, and put into place. And once the crew were certain that they had the assembly right, they would begin the tedious process of driving rivets through all of the precisely aligned holes. The problem is that before you can put a rivet in place, you have to heat it up until it's red hot so that you can form a head on the other end. A rivet, if you've never seen one, is essentially, it looks a lot like a screw, except there's no threads. It's a head and just a straight shaft. So you would heat it up red hot, you would put it in place, and then you would form the head on the other side. Now, typically, you would use a large forge on the ground to heat up all the rivets for a project, and someone would run with the red-hot rivets in a bucket to the place where they're going to be driven in. But obviously, on such a tall tower, that's not an option. By the time you got the rivets up the tower, they would be cool, and you couldn't install them. So instead, Eiffel invented portable forges that went up the tower with the workers. Here's how it worked. There's one worker in the foreground here you can see working the portable forge, heating up the rivets. The worker behind the beam is holding the rivet in place by the head. The worker on the left has a tool that allows them to form the head of the rivet, and the worker on the right, swinging the hammer, is applying the force necessary to form that head. Now, the advantage of construction using this method is that as the rivets cooled down, they would expand. And as they expanded, they would make that joint tighter and tighter until it was a very tight, very secure joint. Now, they repeated this tedious process 2.5 million times, because there are 2.5 million rivets holding the Eiffel Tower together. At the peak of construction, there were 24-man crews working all over the tower, and the portable forges would accompany them all the way up 1,000 feet to the very top of the tower. With all the really complicated stuff behind them other than sheer height, the top part of the tower actually went up quite smoothly. They added about 100 feet every month until they topped the tower out on March 15th, 1889. When the tower was structurally complete, well ahead of the exposition's opening, Eiffel marked the occasion by inviting 15 reporters and Parisian dignitaries to scale the 1,710 steps to the top with him to raise the French flag. Eiffel, who you can see in the center here, is said to have remarked at the time, "Gentlemen, the French flag is now the only flag in the world with a 300-meter flagpole." Now, the reason they had to climb the stairs is because the elevators weren't ready yet. And this might have had something to do with the fact that they were the most complex passenger elevators ever built. This is the elevator that would take you from the ground to the first platform. It was designed by the preeminent Parisian engineering firm of Roux, Combellazier, and Lepape. This was the first angled elevator in the world designed for passengers, so it was built much like a cog railway you would see going up the side of a mountain. Except that electricity was still in very limited use, so this elevator is powered by a hydraulic cylinder, which if you look close, you can see at the top of the screen. And that hydraulic cylinder is driven by a water reservoir on the second level of the tower. When they wanted to ascend, they would release water from the reservoir, and it would push the hydraulic cylinder up, which through a combination of gears and chains would drag the elevator up the side of the tower. When they wanted to go back down, they would release the brakes, and the elevator going down would push the water out of the hydraulic cylinder and back up to the reservoir with the assistance of a small pump. The elevators from the first platform to the second platform caused the most heartburn. Not only was the track angled, it shifted angles mid-run. But that's not what caused the heartburn, at least not directly. You see, there was a clause in the agreement that Eiffel had signed to build the tower that required the use of only French materials and only French contractors. But none of the French elevator companies would bid on this section because it was too complicated. They didn't have the expertise to build this elevator. The first round of bidding ended with only a single bid from the European division of the famous American elevator manufacturer Otis Brothers. But Eiffel was not allowed to accept that bid. he had to do a second round of bidding to try to solicit a French contractor to build this elevator. The second round, predictably, also closed with only a single bidder, Otis Brothers. And so at this point, Eiffel was finally allowed to award the contract to Otis. Now, the only reason that Otis was able to finish their elevator at the same time as the other two is because they had actually started on the design work before the first round of bidding even ended. They were so confident that nobody else in the world could build this elevator. This, too, was a hydraulic elevator driven by the same reservoir as on the second platform. And as it negotiated that curve in the track, the car actually stayed at the same angle relative to the track. The floor of the car would shift so that the passengers would remain at the same angle to the ground the whole time. It was a very complicated arrangement. For the elevators from the second platform to the top, Leonardo had the luxury of a straight vertical run, but that came at the expense of needing to build an elevator that would cover 525 feet. By far the tallest elevator in the world at the time. And this would have been much more difficult for him to engineer if he hadn't had the brilliant idea to split the run in half and allow the cars to counterbalance each other. It meant that passengers had to change elevator cars halfway up, but it worked wonderfully. The first two sets of elevators, the ones from the ground to the first platform and the first platform to the second platform, were actually replaced after about 10 years. But the list that Adu built remained in service for more than 100 years before they were finally replaced in 1983. And the only reason they replaced them is because they too were driven by water and they got tired of them freezing up in the winter. Despite the fact that the first 30,000 visitors to the tower had to climb the 1,710 steps to the top, the tower was a huge success. Eiffel was figuratively and literally on top of the world. When it was completed in 1889, the Eiffel Tower at 1,063 feet was the tallest structure on Earth, more than 500 feet taller than the previous record holder, the Washington Monument. Now, 1,063 feet is approximately equivalent to an 81-story building. The Eiffel Tower would hold that record as the tallest building in the world until the Chrysler Building in New York was topped out 41 years later. No building since the Eiffel Tower has held the record as long as it has. It's a remarkable achievement that broke all kinds of new ground. It's the kind of work that all of us say we want to be doing, right? We want to push the envelope, solve hard problems no one else has solved, ship amazing stuff. So what can we learn from Gustave Eiffel to help us do that? To start, I want to try something. I'm going to put a word up on screen, and I want you, without thinking about it, to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down to show me your general feelings about the subject. All right, so everybody ready? Got your thumbs ready? Okay, here's the word. Yep, lots of thumbs down. Exactly what I'd expect. And I'm glad, too, because I don't know what we would do with the rest of our time together if you'd all been like, yay, I love politics. Most of us would rather just keep our heads down and code, right? Most of us would rather just keep our heads down and code, right? A study published in the Wall Street Journal back in 2011 asked participants about their approach to office politics, and it gave them 3 choices. Number 1, it's best to know what's going on but not participate directly. Number 2, it's best to stay out of office politics completely. And number 3, it's best to participate so you can get ahead. Now, how do you think people answered? Between the group that wanted to stay fully informed but not participate, and the group that wanted to stay out of things altogether, fully 83% of participants picked an answer saying they did not participate in office politics. So you're not alone. I bet some of us have even left jobs because our companies were too political. I know I have. But here's the thing, and it took me way too long to learn this. Every organization is political. You can't escape politics by just moving around enough until you find the right boss or the right company. Anytime you have more than one person working together on something, you'll have politics. Because politics is nothing more than how humans share power and make decisions together. That means that doing anything meaningful in your company, whether it's as simple as getting to do work that you want to do, or as complex as completely overhauling your company's hiring practices to improve diversity and representation, requires you to understand and participate in the politics of your company. I know, what a positive and uplifting message to end the day, right? But stay with me. Politics doesn't have to be negative and gross. There's a couple of things Eiffel does that give us a great example to follow in doing politics the right way. Let's rewind back to the work that Eiffel did before the tower was even built. Remember this paper that Eiffel put together to promote his plan for the tower? He went around from official to official, handing out autographed copies and talking about what he wanted to build. What Eiffel was doing here was pretty simple. He was doing networking and self-promotion. Now, how many of you love networking and self-promotion? Yeah. It brings up the same feelings that politics do, right? But I think these terms get a bad rap that they don't entirely deserve. Let me reframe them a little bit for you. Networking and self-promotion, really nothing more than making friends and telling stories. A little less intimidating, right? But that's all Eiffel was doing. He'd invite someone to lunch, or more likely spend an afternoon on the terrace of a Parisian cafe polishing off a bottle of wine together, and he'd tell stories. He'd regale them with tales of building the Garabit Viaduct. He might even tell them that when a train passed, the bridge was displaced by 8 millimeters, exactly as his mathematical models had predicted before they even started construction. And then he might show them the final drawing of the tower, and maybe talk about how amazing it would be when a tower on French soil passed the height of the great obelisk the Americans had just finished working on. And he listened to their stories too, and by the end of the conversation, he'd have made a friend. Now, importantly, he didn't just do this with people that were on the exhibition committee. The fact that this document is autographed to Georges Boulanger tells us that. Boulanger was in government, and he would go on to be the war minister, but he had absolutely no decision-making power in the exhibition. And that's what networking is all about, just making friends. Maybe you'll be in position to help each other at some point, but it's not an immediate focus. What does that mean for you? Well, it means you should grab coffee with your product manager so they're a human to you, not someone who just drops things in the top of the backlog and demands unrealistic dates. It means you should get lunch with someone in sales because they're the ones that are hearing the questions that your company's customers are asking. And most of them have no idea how you do what you do. They will be fascinated when you tell them how you build software. The second part, self-promotion, is about making sure others know what you've been working on. Not in a braggy way, in an informative way. Much like Eiffel telling the amazing story of the 8 millimeter displacement. He wasn't bragging about it, he was just talking about it. In a perfect world, doing good work would be enough. But your boss is not paying nearly as much attention to you as you think they might be. So you have to tell them what you've been up to. Showing what you've been working on and what you've accomplished is a big part of how you build your reputation at work, with your boss and with other people around the company. If you want a promotion, or you want to build more influence so that you can affect big changes, this is a big part of how you do it. If you want something to help you learn to do this more effectively, I can't recommend Dale Carnegie's classic, How to Win Friends and Influence People, highly enough. It's full of timeless advice on how to do this well in a productive and non-scummy way that benefits you and the people around you. Now, for the other thing Eiffel has to teach us, let's go back to the contract he signed on January 28, 1887. If you'll remember, the French government had originally proposed to cover the entire cost of the tower, but at the last minute they balked, and they only agreed to cover 1/4 of the cost. Well, at that point, it would have been easy for Eiffel to play hardball and demand that the government live up to its original proposal, or he would just walk away. But that's not what he did. Instead, he did a bit of negotiation. Now, this is another one of everyone's favorite words. It probably makes you think of buying a used car and trying not to get screwed, right? So let me reframe it too. It's just cooperation. That's really all good faith negotiation is, working together to find an outcome that works for everyone. Now, Eiffel understood the French government's position, and he had empathy for the government representatives he was talking to. Putting on an exhibition is expensive, and they, frankly, didn't have the 6 million francs to give him. So instead of walking away, he worked with them to find a way to satisfy his need for 6 million francs to build the tower, and their need to only give him 1.5 million of those francs. Now, those two goals sound irreconcilable until you hear what Eiffel did. He found that mutually beneficial solution in being able to charge admission for 20 years. Which, by the way, that turned out to be a phenomenal deal for Gustave Eiffel. An amazing 1.8 million people ascended the tower during the exposition, and they paid an average of 3 francs for the privilege. So if you do the math, by the end of the exposition, the tower had already paid for itself. The other 19 years, just gravy. When we're working for something that we want, there's a temptation to see that process as a zero-sum game. Someone has to win and someone has to lose. Eiffel needed 6 million francs to build the tower, so it was that or bust. Your product manager wants a piece of functionality delivered by an absurd date, so you tell them in no uncertain terms that it's absolutely impossible. In reality, there's almost always a middle ground where everyone gets most of what they want. The trick is figuring out what it actually is that everyone in the situation wants and why they want it. It requires you to exercise empathy and compassion, and to ask probing questions that let you start to build understanding. So when your product manager starts pushing for that unrealistic date, try to understand why. Look to see if there's a smaller piece of functionality you can deliver early that meets whatever need is driving that push. If you want to learn how to negotiate well, grab a copy of Herb Cohen's classic, You Can Negotiate Anything. Now, I know the title's a little bit cheesy, but this book changed the course of my career when one of my mentors recommended it to me years ago. Cohen teaches a style of negotiation that revolves around understanding everyone's needs, especially your own, and getting to agreement by finding mutually beneficial ways to fulfill them and giving up things that aren't essential to you. So what about bad politics? Are there organizations and bosses that are overly political? Of course there are. Now, if you find yourself in an organization that regularly promotes those that play the game instead of those that do good work, or regularly promotes people that look a certain way and ignores others, you might need to leave. Or if you find yourself working for a boss that always takes credit for your good work, even when you let them know that you've noticed and you find it upsetting, there might not be enough networking and self-promotion for you to get around that. But if Gustave Eiffel didn't find the French government too political to navigate and negotiate with, there's a good chance that that bar is higher than you think it is. By the end of the 20 years Eiffel had been promised, the tower was too much a part of Paris's global identity to do anything but leave it right where it stood. Eiffel's tower is still standing 129 years later. While it hasn't been the tallest structure on the planet for a while, it remains the most visited paid monument in the world, with nearly 7 million people waiting in line for hours each year to take in the breathtaking views of Paris that it provides. Had Eiffel not been willing to participate in the politics involved, we wouldn't have the Eiffel Tower. And the same is true for you. You can choose to keep your head down and to hop from job to job every time you get a whiff of politics. But doing that will stunt your career. Even if you want to stay on the individual contributor track and become a senior technical contributor, you'll need to understand politics to develop the influence you need to drive technical decisions. If, instead of running, you just accept that politics is a reality, neither good nor bad in and of itself, and you learn to participate in organizational politics in a way that remains true to you and to the things that you value, you can find ways to have huge impact in your organization and maybe even the world. It may seem intimidating, but you can do it. I know you can. Good luck.